All right. Welcome, everybody. Slim Chance Cowboy here with the Rugged Revival. I am very pleased to announce my interview guest for today's interview is Mr. Eric Grate, who is a author based out of Kentucky. And Eric is very kind to give us his time today to plug a new book that we will be talking about. Thanks for taking the time out to meet with me today, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brad. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Absolutely. So, for everybody that may or may not follow me, I'm a little bit of tidbit about it. I do not cannot ever have read fiction books. I'm a nonfiction guy. I like reading biographies. I like reading books about real events. Yeah, just personally, I have a hard time reading dialogue and following it in my head and remembering all the characters. So going back about 20 years now, I have read just about every book that's been put out of old country musicians. I've read Buck Owens's book and a couple books on Waylon and 10 books on Johnny Cash, you name it. Roger Miller, even some of the more obscure. I used to hound eBay for some obscure books that came out like in the 80s. So I was very pleased to see, and I forget how I saw this, Eric, but Eric is authoring a book about, the Adams brothers, who were famously as a part of the Jones Boys, George Jones's band, Johnny Paycheck's band, countless others. And so when I saw this, I'm like, this is something I love. This is not a household name. However, they are pretty much gelled into the fabric of country music for 2 or 3 decades. So I thought this would be a great time to talk to Eric and get ready for the book. So I guess first, Eric, in short, I wanted to, by the way, don't go into too much detail. I want people to read the book, but
Right.
tell us just a little bit about how you got to know the Adams brothers. And of course, you grew up, I think, with them and Paycheck also in Ohio. Why
Yeah,
don't you just give us a little bit of tidbit on how you met them?
sure. Yeah. Well, I'm from a little town in southern Ohio, Greenfield, Ohio, and that just happens to be the hometown of Johnny Paycheck. Okay. And it's also the hometown of the Adams brothers. Um, Paycheck and the Adams brothers, they actually grew up literally in the same neighborhood in Greenfield back in the the 30s and 40s, the 50s. They were neighbors. They hung out together. They played music together. The whole nine yards. And growing up in Greenfield, of course, I was immersed with Paycheck stories. From the very beginning. Both the good and the bad, I guess. And as you well know, there's a little of both about Paycheck. And beg your pardon.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, he was known as I think he was known as Donald Lytle back then, right?
Yeah, he was born Donald Lytle, and of course, when he went to Nashville, he changed his name to Donnie Young.
Yeah.
For a little while, and actually, he made some really good music as Donnie Young, but it just never caught on. Unfortunately, nobody bought the records.
Yeah.
And then later he became Johnny Paycheck, but the Adams brothers, of course, I grew up hearing about them as well, and ended up going to school with one of Don Adams' daughters, and we actually dated for a while in high school. And the first time I really met Don was going over to the house to see her. And, I would knock on the door and walk through the living room, and Don Adams would be sitting in the living room in his chair, something like this. And he just kind of eyeballed me as I came across the living room, and he never really said anything to me, and I'm like, oh, wow, this isn't going over too great. But, I found out he treated all the boys that came to the house that way, I guess. So
yeah, as can be expected.
Yeah, give it the dad treatment. So yeah, that's how I became familiar with both Paycheck and the Adams brothers. Just growing up in the same hometown and just hearing all the stories and listening to all the music.
Yeah, that's a great little story. So this much I do admire about you. You started writing later in life. I think this is only going to be your second published book. Is that correct?
It's my third, actually. It's my third book, but yeah, I didn't really start writing until my mid-50s. I just turned 60 years old in October, and I was in my mid-50s, about 54, I guess, when I started dabbling in it a little bit. And it took me forever to write my first book. I didn't know what I was doing, and I started writing fiction. I've
Okay.
written two books of short stories, and they're both pretty much set in Greenfield. Uh,
Okay.
so that's kind of been my focus of my writing, I guess, is just writing about what I know, and that's Greenfield, Ohio, I guess.
Yeah. So did was there a proposition of sorts or to write this book? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Did kind of the inspiration come from Don Adams himself
Oh yeah.
just by swapping stories, or had you considered when you started your writing career, had you considered them as a subject?
Never crossed my mind. Never crossed my mind. Back in February, I think it was February 17th, maybe, of last year, 2025, I got a message from Don. And we were Facebook friends, right? And we hadn't actually spoken to each other in many, many years.
Mhm.
And I just got a message from Don Adams one day. My wife and I were in the car driving up to Lexington, and it said, "Eric, call me at this number." I'm like, wow, that's a little weird. I'm trying to think, man, what did I do to Don Adams? And, those are kind of the wrong guys to, get
Yeah.
on the wrong side of.
Right.
So, so I ended up giving him a call, and I recognized the voice immediately. It was Don, and he answered the phone and this is how he answered it. He said, "Eric, we need to write a book." He didn't say hello. He didn't say, "Eric, we need to write a book."
Straight to the point.
Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, how you doing, Don? He said we need to write a book. He doubled down, and I'm like, what do we need to write a book about, Don? I couldn't. And he says the Notorious Adams Boys, and I want to tell it all. And I said, wow, okay. I said, Don, I write fiction. I've never written anything like this before. And he said, you can do it because you're from Greenfield. And I guess being from Greenfield, Ohio, was enough.
Yeah.
For Don anyway.
Well, you got the stamp of approval from the subject matter. So yeah.
I guess so. Yeah. So, I kind of decided almost right away I was going to do it, but I thought maybe I shouldn't commit that quickly. So I asked him to give me a day to think about it. And then I called him the next day and said, "Hey, let's do it."
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, I'll be honest with you. I definitely knew the Jones Boys. I mean, I'm a George Jones. I think me and you talked a little bit before this interview. Jones and Paycheck are probably in my top 3 or 4 of just overall artists. So I'm a huge George Jones guy. So I know the Jones Boys. However, I will say the first time I was exposed to them by name was the Tales from the Tour Bus series that Mike Judge did, and I'm a child of the '90s. So Mike Judge for me, Beavis and Butthead, King of the Hill. When I saw this was coming out, and it was, season 1 was country music, and it was George Jones and Paycheck and Jerry Lee and Waylon. I was like, this is fantastic. And I watched it. And that was my first time getting to know the Adams brothers by name. And it seemed like, and all 3 of them, of course, they were in caricature form, but they were sitting around just telling these stories. And of course, I never thought there'd be a book about it. But how did that come to light with them and Mike Judge? And did you think the brothers enjoyed that? And do you think that they knew that they were maybe getting some, I don't want to call it fame, but some recognition from that series?
Yeah. It kind of came out of nowhere, though. That whole Tales of the Tour Bus thing did. And there's a man in Greenfield by the name of Jeff Cropper. And Jeff, he's dabbled in music some. He sang a little bit, and he was real active on YouTube. He still is, actually, and a big Johnny Paycheck fan. Has always promoted the country music scene in Greenfield through his YouTube and social media and that type of thing. It was actually his idea, right? And I think Jeff had the idea, but he just didn't really know what to do with it. If that makes sense. He's like, man, I have this great idea, but I don't know what to do with it. So he mentioned it to a couple other folks in town, a gentleman by the name of Lanny Bryant, and he had some contacts somehow, and I don't really know what they were, but he has some contacts that put them in touch with Mike Judge.
Wow.
And then, I guess Mike Judge just picked right up on it and took off with it. And The Adams brothers were aware that Jeff Cropper had this idea and was pushing it around. And, when it took off, you know, the Adams brothers, they never shied away from publicity, at all. So they were quite pleased. They enjoyed being in the limelight. They really did. And so they were quite pleased with it. You know, and Don, I should probably mention this. Arnie and Gary had already passed by the time I really started working with Don on this book. And, Gary and Arnie, I think maybe more than Don, really got into the, having the attention pointing at them. They really took off with it. And Don kind of went along with it. Don could be a little bit, I don't know. He could be a little crotchety sometimes if he wanted to be.
Yeah. Okay.
And there were things about the series that I think maybe didn't set real well with him. Not the way the series came out, but just, him having to, get on a plane and go out to California to film it. And, I don't, money wasn't a huge deal to them, but they didn't make a whole lot of money off of it. They did make some. And so, Don, he complained a little bit about just the actions he had to go through to make it, but not the series itself.
Okay. Well, look, they could have made, this is no, I'm not breaking news here, but they could have made an entire season of 10 or 12 episodes on Jones. And I do like one of the stories, one of the Adams brothers, it might've been Don, said that they always knew when George was drunk because of his hair. And that if he was good, his hair, he used about a can of hairspray, Aquanet on his hair. But if his hair was messed up, they knew he was on a bender. I thought that was a pretty funny story.
Yeah. They could really, once they got started on George, especially they got started on him, just even on the show and just in conversation, Don rather, he could really just take off, and it was so funny to hear him talk and the way he talked about it.
What a treat that must have been. So thinking about the Adams Boys and their musical kind of tapestry, how do you think, maybe collectively, individually, that they would compare to some of their contemporaries of the time? People like Buddy Emmons, Don Rich, Daryl McCall, because there's a lot of people that are household names. Don Rich, for one. Don Rich was Buck Owens' left-hand man. But I didn't know the Adams Boys by name until that series, even though I knew the Jones Boys as a backing band. So how do you think that they match up? And maybe Don told you writing this book on what he thought about some of his peers and their stance in country music history.
Well, I'll tell you, let's start with Gary Adams. First, Don, of course, fronted the band and, as the vocalist, and what attention they got. I'd say Don got the lion's share of it by name. Yeah. But Gary Adams was an incredible guitar player. And, some of the people that I've interviewed for this book, I'm talking guys like Doug Jernigan, Brent Mason.
Okay. Yeah.
Steve Marple, who was drummer for George Jones and Johnny Paycheck, Ralph May, Ohio Country Music Hall of Fame, vocalists. Just, we're talking guys that are in the know, and they all agree that Gary Adams was without peer as far as guitar players go. According to them, Gary was the best guitar player in Nashville from the 1960s up through probably the late 1980s, and everyone knew him. Now, the reason Gary, in my estimation, didn't become a household name outside of Nashville, like, maybe like Don Rich, for example, did, or, Buddy Emmons or anyone like that, was Gary liked to be on stage. These other guys, they were getting into the recording studio, and there's a lot more video of them out there. But
Right.
Gary was out playing honky tonks, man.
Yeah.
That's what he wanted to do, you
Yeah.
know. So it kind of, I guess, stunted his growth a little bit that way in the public perception. And Don was an incredible vocalist. I mean, he had 5 songs, in the top 60, I think, in the Billboard charts. He didn't not make it as a superstar in his own right because he lacked the talent.
Yeah.
Okay. What hurt Don was Don didn't want to leave Greenfield, Ohio. Don did not want to live in Nashville.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
it's hard to make it in Nashville if you're not living there.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you can make it and move away later, but you can't really get your foot in the door.
Especially back then. I mean, only guys like George Strait really made that, because Strait never lived in Nashville. Toby Keith never lived in Nashville. Guys like that. But back in those days, you're absolutely right. You had to be in Nashville. Yeah.
Yeah. But they held their own. I mean, they were Buddy Emmons, Gary Adams, Don Adams, Johnny Paycheck, Daryl McCall. They were right there. I mean, they were in the same group as these guys, and a lot of folks will tell you that they were at the top of the pile.
Yeah. Well, one of my follow-up questions to that I didn't share with you prior was, did the Adams brothers, do a lot of studio cuts, unless they were not with George or Johnny, or was it all just were they just really touring guys?
They were mainly touring guys, and in 1964, I think, is when George recorded "The Race Is On."
Yep, 64. Yeah, you're right. Yep.
64. Yeah. Gary Adams had actually went to George and said, "Hey," he said, "we go out on the road with you and we play 300 shows a year, but when you come back to Nashville, you get these." Studio guys to go in and, cut records with you. And Gary told him, he said, that really doesn't sit right with me. Gary would tell you, right? And Gary said, I got a suggestion for you. He said, next time you go on the road, he said, why don't you get some of these studio guys, see if they'll go on the road with you.
Yeah.
and George said, hey, let's go into the studio and record. So they did not every song on The Race Is On, but they did the majority of the cuts on The Race Is On. And then after that, they were in the studio periodically. With Paycheck, Gary was in the studio a lot with him and co-wrote several Paycheck songs. Don did background vocals on Mr. Lovemaker. Okay. And he did parts on a few other songs, but Gary probably spent actually more time in the studio than any of them after that. But that kind of goes against what I said before. Gary spent more time in the studio than any of the other Adams boys, but in the whole scope of thing, it was about that much as compared to guys like, Buddy Emmons and, Don Rich, people like that. It was very little that they did.
Okay. Yeah. Well, is there again, without divulging any of your secret weapons from your book, any funny or interesting stories on your interviews, whether it be from the Adams brothers themselves, Paycheck, Jones, that maybe would surprise some folks, or, because we all know, everyone drank, everyone had, had a fun time back then, but is there a similar story or a specific story that may have stood out to you? Again, without divulging too much about the book.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. There's so many stories that I could tell one or two and not scratch the surface, honestly. So, yeah. So, would you rather hear one about the Adams brothers, or would you rather hear one about maybe about George?
Give me one about the Adams brothers. That's the subject matter of the book. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, in 1967 or 68, and I know in the book, but I just can't remember off the top of my head, but 67 or 68, Gary Adams and Doug Jernigan were playing with Little Jimmy Dickens. They were traveling all over the country with Little Jimmy Dickens, and they were one evening they were in a hotel room, and Doug told me he thought it was maybe somewhere in Colorado, but he couldn't remember exactly. Well, they were in the hotel room and said it must have been about 1 in the morning, and Doug and Gary were sharing a room, and they were carrying on pretty good. And next door, Jimmy was staying in his own room next door, and I guess about 1 in the morning they hear on the door, and Doug goes to the door and opens it up, and it's Jimmy Dickens in his underwear, t-shirt, and his Stetson. Right, Jimmy was 4'11".
Yeah, right.
He's standing there in his underwear, t-shirt, and Stetson, and I guess Doug turns around, looks at Gary, and says Gary said we have company. So Gary comes over, and Jimmy has his hands on his hips. And this is the way Doug describes it, had his hands on his hips and said, "Listen, pal," he said, "you're going to have to hold it down around here," because he said, "I need to get some sleep." So Gary just stares at Jimmy for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, what seemed like an eternity, then reaches out and takes Jimmy's Stetson off of his head, looks at Jimmy, sinks his teeth into the brim, and takes a bite out of his hat and puts it back on Jimmy's head. So Jimmy just didn't say a word. He just turned around and stomped back off to his into his room. And there was never a word said about it until paychecks came out later in the week. And Gary had a rather large deduction out of his paycheck for a new Stetson for little Jimmy Dickens. But
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I wonder if Jimmy wore that on stage the next show.
I don't know.
If he had a backup in
Maybe he put it up on a shelf somewhere or something. But I'll tell you one more about little Jimmy and his Stetson. The Adams Boys were rough on his Stetson because in 1965, the Adams brothers did a television tour with Jimmy Dickens. They were on the late or Johnny Carson. They were on Jimmy Dean. They were on Hullabaloo. They were on several of the shows with him, and they were doing a taping in Los Angeles for that, one of the dance shows, maybe Ninth Street West or something like that.
Mm.
And Jimmy and Arnie Adams, the drummer, they had a little disagreement, about one thing or the other. And Arnie lifted Jimmy's Stetson off of his head in the parking lot and jumped about 3 feet in the air and came down on it with both feet and just stomped it into the ground. And so they had this thing about Jimmy Dickens and his Stetson. They were pretty.
The hat was about as big as Jimmy was.
It was. Jimmy could hide in it like a turtle or something.
Yeah.
But they were
an easy target.
What's that?
It was an easy target.
Oh yeah. They were rough on it. There's a lot in the book about Jimmy Dickens, even though they're not as nearly as associated with Dickens as they are Paycheck and Jones, and even Gary played with Marty Robbins later too. But
oh wow,
in the '80s he played with Marty Robbins. But even though they're not as associated with Jimmy Dickens, that the time they spent with him was just it was so much came out of that, just story wise. That it takes probably more of the book than what you would anticipate it might take with Jimmy Dickens.
That's great. I can't wait to read it. So that's a perfect segue, and I appreciate your time. You've been so gracious. So why don't you tell the people that will be watching this when the book comes out, where they can get it, and what's next for you?
Okay, well, the book comes out on April 20th. So just a couple more weeks away. It comes out on April 20th. Of course, it'll be available on Amazon. It'll be available at select bookstores across the country, hopefully. I am going on a pretty extensive tour right now, or getting ready to go, I should say, with book signings. And I'll be doing a lot of radio and TV segments to try to promote the book. And so, folks, if they'll follow me on my Facebook page or on my website, they'll be able to keep up with that. I'm pretty optimistic, honestly, about the book. I think it'll resonate with country music fans for sure. Even if you're not a country music fan, if you just like a good story and some just funny stories,
Yeah.
you'll like the book, I think. Um, as far as what's next for me, I was about 80% of the way through with another book when Don lassoed me into this. And so I'm going to go back and finish that book. And then after that, I honestly don't know, what'll be next for me. I kind of like this nonfiction thing a little bit,
Maybe see if you could, because I don't think I haven't checked. I don't think there is one. Maybe you could, I don't know, get some Greenfield people together and try to write one on Paycheck.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm going to say this. I don't want to take up too much time here, but
Oh, no, it's the time is yours.
I want to say this. Paycheck he's a bit of a pariah in Nashville, and
Yep.
I don't know why. I do know why. I guess there's never been a book written about Johnny Paycheck, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me because, and I've said this before, when if it was the mid 1970s and you wanted to talk about the outlaw movement or outlaw country, you would talk about Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson.
Yeah, right.
Chris Christopherson, Billy Joe Shaver, a couple others. Johnny Paycheck would honestly have been an afterthought then. He really was. In hindsight, people really look at Johnny Paycheck as being almost a founding member of outlaw music, and he really wasn't. He came along as the outlaw movement was starting to taper off. It had peaked by the time Paycheck got in there. But if you ask folks today about outlaw country music, it's Johnny Paycheck, and I would dare say a lot of people would mention Paycheck before they would Waylon Jennings or Willie Nelson. A lot of folks would. He has almost a cult following out there now.
I mean, look, he should be in the Hall of Fame. And if someone were to, I mean, this comes up to me all the time, because people find out, whether it be work colleagues or acquaintances, what kind of music you into, and I tell them, it's an odd question because I'm a music man, and it's like, well, I guess to make a long story short, I just tell them country, but but I could go on and on and on about what type, and I'll say, old country or something, and almost always people go like, oh, Garth Brooks, and I'm like, no, not Garth Brooks. So, but like if someone that knew nothing about country music said, well, give me a couple artists that I should listen to, I mean, I would start with Paycheck Jones, and then I'd probably have to stop and think about maybe someone else they should listen to. So it kind of, I mean, I'm totally right there with you. It's he was definitely the music just well, that, and he played a lot with Lloyd Green played steel on a lot of those Little Darlin' records, and those are, I mean, I got a copy of Jukebox Charlie sitting right there on the shelf. It's just a sound that was kind of new to the time, and he had I don't know, he just had a way of singing, and the songs, it made him sound big, bad, and tough, but he really wasn't. No. I guess, and he was, I believe he was a pretty small guy actually to begin with.
He was 5'5".
Yeah. So he had a way of singing, and I've been a Paycheck fan for a very long time.
Yeah, and his shelf life has been just unbelievable. Johnny Paycheck has, and yet no one's written a book about him. But I think a lot of it is because, I'm not saying Waylon and Willie weren't outlaws. I mean, they wore big hats and cowboy boots and jeans and all that. But let's face it, Johnny Paycheck was shooting guys in bars. Okay, he was going to prison. Okay, he was running with the Hell's Angels. He was using cocaine like he thought they were going to run out. He needed to use all he could. Time he was living an outlaw lifestyle. And I think that just kind of turned maybe a lot of people in Nashville off and kind of made him untouchable in a way. It's what's keeping him out of the Hall of Fame, that behavior. But to answer your question, writing a book about him, I don't know if it would be possible because I'm not sure whoever wrote that book would be able to get the blessing of the Lytle family, the Lytle Paycheck family.
Yeah.
I honestly would question that. So it would be tough to write it. But that being said, there's a lot of Johnny Paycheck in my book. And I even took the liberty to write a special section in the book about the December 19th, 1985 shooting in the North High Lounge in Hillsboro, Ohio.
Yeah.
That's the town from
over turtle soup, maybe?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no.
Okay.
And that's all I'm going to say about that one.
Yeah.
There's more to it than that.
Yeah, right.
And I'm going to write, I have written the most thorough account of that story that has ever been written. I've interviewed people that have never been interviewed, including Lloyd Bowers, who was 2 feet away when Paycheck shot Larry Wise, and a man by the name of Greg Smith, who was standing there when they arrested Johnny Paycheck. Neither one of them have ever been interviewed until I interviewed him.
Well, you got me absolutely perched for that then, because
that's a bonus, because the Adams Boys are bit players in that, but I couldn't resist it.
Yeah.
Once I started diving into it just a little bit, I was like, wow, there's a lot of an untold story here that folks do not know about. And there's a lot of myth and a lot of things that just absolutely did not happen that have been associated with the story as well. And there's some things that you've never heard that are just as crazy. So.
Great. Well, Eric, I appreciate your time. I'm running out of time. I guess Zoom just told me I have to upgrade to Pro to get more than 40 minutes.
Heck no.
I know. So I appreciate your time. I will be plugging this hard. I'll be plugging your book. I will be buying. I actually tried to pre-order on your website, but I already have a marker set in my calendar on April 20th to order the book. So
I appreciate it.
I will be plugging it for all of my followers out there. Author is Eric Grate. The book is The Notorious Adams Brothers. It is out on April 20th. Check all your bookstores, check Amazon, check anywhere. And long live country music and the Adams Brothers.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks for having me on today. It's been great talking to you. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Thanks.